Hello, I'm Michael Clark, and I'm a piano teacher based in Houston, Texas. Thanks for joining me as we trace the practice of redistribution through keyboard history. Let's start by defining redistribution. The term implies the existence of an initial distribution or division of notes between the two hands that is conveyed by the composer through the score. This distribution is shown through a variety of notational cues, including staff placement, stem direction, and written instructions. If pianists choose to alter this note distribution for any reason, whether technical or musical, they redistribute the notes. Redistribution is a controversial topic in some circles. Some may wonder, does changing the distribution of notes violate the composer's intent? Is it wrong to make a passage easier by dividing it between the hands? I think this stems from the more rigid performance practice trends of the mid-20th century, reacting against the perceived excesses of the 19th century. Today we're going to examine this history more closely, so we're better informed when making our own decisions about redistribution. We know that many great pianists of the 19th and early 20th centuries suggested redistributions in their editions of standard repertoire. If we look back further, we'll discover that some of the composer-pianists we most revere, including Chopin and Liszt, used redistribution. And a century before, both J.S. and C.P.E. Bach discussed how to divide contrapuntal lines between the hands. We're going to touch on all of that today. But in order to really understand the origins of redistribution, we need to go all the way back to the beginning. The history of redistribution is inseparable from the history of note distribution, and consequently from the history of keyboard notation. Put differently, a particular division of the notes between the hands must be conveyed through the score in order for performers to alter it. If the notation does not prescribe a specific division of the notes between the hands, the status of much keyboard music of the 16th and 17th centuries, performers must assign it themselves. What we'll discover today is that the principles that guided early keyboard performers in determining the division of notes between the hands are important precursors to the principles guiding the practice of redistribution. With that in mind, let's go back to the beginning. Prior to the 18th century, keyboard music appeared in diverse notational formats. The very earliest keyboard manuscripts, dating from the 14th century, already reflect diverging approaches. The English Roberts Bridge Codex includes dances and entabulations that combine an upper part in minstrel notation on a 5-line staff with a lower part written in letters. As you see here, they're very small. In contrast, the entabulations found in the Groningen Library use 2 5-line staves, the format still used today. Despite their differences, both systems employ a common layout with practical applications for hand division. 2 parallel notational streams, the upper one indicating the notes for the right hand and the lower one indicating the notes for the left hand. Over the next 3 centuries, notational formats varied widely by region. 2 staff formats prevailed in England, France, and Italy, though the number of staff lines changed, often with more lines in the lower staff. Italian and Spanish sources also include a large body of keyboard music, notated in open score, 1 staff per musical line, with prominent keyboard composers like Marullo and Frescobaldi using both 2 staff and open score formats. In Spain and Germany, keyboardists developed unique tablature traditions. German tablature used letters, and Spanish tablature used numbers. These various notational approaches fall into 2 categories: those that indicate hand distribution, which I label prescriptive, and those that do not, or non-prescriptive. The 2 staff formats, especially those employing more than 5 lines, are prescriptive, maintaining a clear distinction between notes for the right hand on the upper staff and the left hand on the lower staff. Open score and tablature traditions, however, were non-prescriptive. Performers reading these formats were left to determine on their own how best to divide the notes. It is from performers using non-prescriptive formats that we get our first discussions of keyboard fingering and hand division. The first recorded keyboard fingerings come from around 1520 in Hans Buchner's Fundamentum. This notational format is known as Old German tablature, and it separates out each musical line like an open score. The top line, shown here in red, is in mensural notation, with notes printed on the staff. The middle line in yellow and the lowest line in blue are in tablature, with printed letters to indicate pitch and stems above the letters to indicate rhythm. Here's how this piece looks in modern notation. Buchner provides a fingering for each note in this piece, putting a slash through fingerings for the left hand, as you see here, and then regular numerals for fingerings for the right hand. At the beginning of the piece, when just 2 voices enter, he assigns 1 line to each hand. When the third voice enters, he switches the middle voice to the left hand. The middle voice stays in the left hand except when the distance between the lower 2 voices is greater than an octave. at which point Buchner switches the middle voice briefly to the right hand. Buchner's fingerings illustrate the first two principles of keyboard hand division, that musical lines should be divided equally between the hands where possible, and that wide stretches should be split between the hands. If we jump ahead to the end of the 16th century, we find the first mention of a third principle of keyboard hand division. This excerpt is from the 1583 Tablature book of Jakob Peix. It uses New German tablature in which all the voices are notated with letters. In his preface, Peix discusses how consolidating many voices in one hand can free the other hand for quick-moving passage work or ornamentation. He writes, "I have industriously explored how three voices can be played with one hand so that an embellishment may result at the same time." This excerpt shows one possible realization of this idea. As shown in blue, the left hand can play the lower three voices beneath the blue bracket, allowing the right hand to play the faster-moving notes more freely. Taken together, three principles of hand division emerge from German sources. First, when only two voices are present, they may be divided between the hands. Second, when two adjacent parts are separated by more than an octave, one or more notes should be transferred to the other hand. And third, multiple voices may be consolidated in one hand to free the other hand to accommodate fast-moving notes or ornamentation. If we had more time, we could explore how these same principles are cited in Spanish and Italian sources, but for now, we'll jump ahead to the 18th century, when two five-line staves became commonplace throughout Europe. By 1700, the two five-line staves were the standard. As a general principle, notes for the right hand were notated in the upper staff, and notes for the left hand were in the lower staff. But this was not always the case, especially in contrapuntal compositions. For guidance in these matters, we can of course turn to Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. Bach writes that in three or more part compositions where each voice expresses an individual line, there arise situations in which the hands must be interchanged in order to perform the notes correctly, even though one hand should play them according to the notation. Bach provides one example to illustrate this principle, though he notates it on only one staff, which is more than a little confusing. His point is that a middle voice should be traded between the hands as necessary to accommodate the notes. As shown here in yellow, Bach divides the 16th notes in the second beat between the hands. This necessity is apparent to anyone who's played a fugue, of course, and fortunately we have one example from a fugue of J.S. Bach where he explicitly shows how he would divide the notes. This is an early version of the fugue in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 2. This passage requires rather frequent exchanges of the middle voice between the hands. The way Bach distributes the inner voice reflects the same principles as keyboardists 2 centuries earlier. He divides the voices as equally as possible, he splits wide stretches between the hands, and he isolates ornaments and fast-moving passages in one hand, consolidating the remaining voices in the other hand to allow for more technical freedom. With CPE Bach's guidance, we can see the two ends of the spectrum in 18th century keyboard notation. For polyphonic compositions, performers must look past the notation to determine the hand distribution that best articulates the counterpoint. In most other repertoire, hand division is generally clear. When composers desire a special configuration of the hands, they mark it through stem direction, clef changes, or written instructions. Bach's conception of the relationship between notation and execution is complicated by a surprising comment buried within his discussion of hand crossings. Compositions can be found in which the composer calls for needless crossing. The performer should not feel obliged to indulge in such imposturing, but should seek instead a more natural execution, he says. This rare elevation of the performer's judgment in matters of practical realization seems ahead of its time, perhaps more characteristic of a 19th century artist. Bach's comments pull back the curtain ever so slightly on the licenses he and his contemporaries may have taken in their own performances. Speaking of the 19th century, it's time to dive into that fabled age of excess. Let's start by taking a look at redistributions used by Chopin and Liszt. In addition to performing and composing, Chopin and Liszt each devoted considerable energy to teaching piano. Many insights into the interpretation of Chopin's and Liszt's own works, including alternative hand distributions, can be gleaned from the documented recollections of their students. The most detailed record available of how Chopin taught his own works is his markings preserved in his students' scores, particularly those of Jane Stirling and Camille Dubois. In addition to fingerings, dynamics, phrasings, and numerous other expressive markings, these scores contain 8 indications of hand redistribution. Though no commentary survives giving Chopin's explicit reasons for reassigning these notes, his pedagogical motivations can be discerned easily enough, and falls into one of 3 categories: eliminating wide stretches, facilitating position shifts, and simplifying passages for one hand by dividing them between the hands. For the sake of time today, we'll just look at one of each category. First, an example where Chopin suggested eliminating a stretch. This is from the prelude in D-flat major, and as you can see here in the middle section, as the left hand descends, the intervals get wider until here it's a tenth. So this little pencil marking indicates that the higher E can be taken into the right hand so that the student doesn't have to stretch. Next, we have an example where Chopin suggested a redistribution to facilitate position shifts. This is from the scherzo in B-flat minor. Right here, the left hand and right hand are both trilling, but then the right hand has to leap over 5 octaves to this high F. So Chopin drew this little brace here and wrote MG, meaning left hand, so the left hand can play those 2 grace notes as an octave, giving the right hand extra time to move up. And lastly, we have this example from the nocturne in C-sharp minor. As it transitions to the middle section, the left hand is now alone, and you can see these faint little stems that Chopin has drawn to suggest notes that the right hand can take to make the position shifts easier in the left hand, eliminate crossings, create a smoother sound. Unlike Chopin, who worked privately with his students and made numerous markings in their scores, Liszt taught only in groups, addressing one student's playing for the benefit of the class. As a result, Liszt's teaching legacy survives not in marked scores, but in his comments on a wealth of repertoire preserved through the notes of those present at his master classes. The most detailed accounts available are found in the diaries of August Güllerich, who recorded 2 instances of Liszt recommending alternative hand distributions in his own compositions, in each case suggesting to play a passage notated for one hand alone with 2 hands. The first example is from Un Sospiro, shown here. Güllerich noted, in bar 29, the master said one should make a fairly long octave whirlpool with both hands instead of with the right hand alone, as written. So he's speaking about this con forza section, which looks like octaves for the right hand, but Liszt is suggesting that to make this octave whirlpool, which I suppose implies a faster, louder sound, it would be better to play it with both hands. Güllerich notes a similar recommendation to divide an octave passage between the hands in the Rigoletto paraphrase. Liszt advised the performer playing that day to play the octaves in bars 1 through 6 with 2 hands so that they come out really staccato. His comment identifies a musical problem, the articulation is unconvincing, and proposes a technical solution, performing the passage with 2 hands instead of 1. Liszt again affirms that the desired quality of sound should dictate the manner of execution, even if that goes against the hand division implied by the notation. In these 2 instances, the greatest technician of the age suggests that dividing octave passages between the hands, what some might construe as mere facilitation, can help achieve musical goals, like maximizing power and ensuring crisp articulation. Liszt presents these alternative fingerings as valuable tools for artistry, rather than cheap tricks or cheats. We've seen how 2 composer pianists were open to redistributions in their own music. Let's now consider how notable pianists use redistribution in the works of other composers. Prior to the mid-19th century, alternative hand distributions were an element of piano technique relegated to the private pedagogy of the music studio. In the latter half of the 19th century, a shift occurred as publishers began to release heavily edited versions of historical repertoire in which notable pianists provided numerous technical and interpretive instructions. You can see here from this excerpt from Hans von Bülow's edition that the commentary could sometimes take up as much as half the page or more. These editions reveal much about the performance practices of the era, including the widespread use of redistribution. I took editions of Beethoven's piano sonatas as a case study to better understand traditions of redistribution in the late 19th century. I focused my research on 5 editions by major pianists, the joint edition of Zygmunt Leber and Hans von Bülow, and the editions of Karl Klindworth, Moritz Moszkowski, Alfredo Casella, and Arthur Schnabel. You can see here they range from 1871 to the 1920s, and in this graph it shows how the number of redistributions just continued to climb, but then there was a sharp decline with Arthur Schnabel's edition, although he still has quite a few. So taken together, these 5 editions present over 270 redistributions across Beethoven's 32 sonatas. About 40% of these are unique to just one edition, but 50 examples, nearly 20% of the total, appear in 4 or 5 editions, representing a strong consensus in the tradition. Within this tradition, the editor's reasons for redistribution can be grouped into 5 main categories. facilitating or eliminating position shifts, minimizing extreme reaches across the body, avoiding stretched hand positions, improving legato connection, and isolating material in one hand to allow optimal fingering. You may recognize that two of these are the same hand division principles that date back to the 16th century. These categories occasionally overlap, and particular redistributions may accomplish multiple goals. Nevertheless, the categories offer a useful framework for understanding why these great pianists suggested alternative hand distributions. Let's take a look at one representative example of each. First, let's take a look at an example designed to facilitate or eliminate position shifts. In this excerpt from the Sonata Opus 54, Beethoven has written a trill on a high D and then a leap down nearly 2 octaves to a trill on a low E. Hans von Bülow suggested that the second trill could be played by the left hand and the parts basically reversed. This allows it eliminates the gap that might happen as you leap down, and it could eliminate any accent that occurs on the way down. Next, an example for minimizing extreme reaches across the body. This is a new problem that developed as the range of the piano increased and the composers explored more extreme registers. It might require the hands to go down or up in a way that may be uncomfortable. So here we can see that Beethoven has written a low B flat with the right hand thumb, and that is a little bit of a twist. So Klindworth suggested that the left hand could take those notes to eliminate that twist. Avoiding stretched positions, as we know, this one dates all the way back to the Renaissance, but in those days, eliminating stretched positions was normally about a simultaneous chord of maybe a tenth and taking one of those notes into the right hand. But there's more possibilities in music with more active textures. As in this example here from Opus 31, number 1, the alto voice has these lower neighbors that create an awkward stretch between the alto and soprano, especially if you're trying to play that legato. So Karl Klindworth developed this ingenious solution where as the left hand leaps up to play these thirds, it can grab 2 notes from the inner voice to facilitate that stretch. Another major 19th century priority, of course, was maintaining legato connection. And that can be difficult if you're handling 2 parts in one hand, as in this passage from the Pathétique. In order to keep legato in the top line, it might be difficult to stretch for some hands. So Hans von Bülow suggested that 2 notes be taken in the left hand to facilitate the legato connection in the soprano line. And lastly, an example for isolating material in one hand to allow optimal fingering. So we saw how Jakob Peix suggested that ornaments could be added more easily if voices are consolidated in the left hand. And this is kind of the reverse of that. Beethoven has added the ornament and another part in the same hand. And Karl Klindworth thought that it would be more comfortable to play these notes with the left hand. So he adds a pedal marking so the left hand can play these and then the right hand can use a more optimal fingering for the trill. This has been a whirlwind summary of the history of redistribution. We've seen how Renaissance keyboardists using non-prescriptive notational formats established 3 general principles for keyboard hand division. Divide voices evenly, avoid stretches, and isolate ornaments and fast notes in one hand. We've seen how the Bach family divided polyphonic works freely between the hands. We've seen how Chopin and Liszt advised students to split passages between the hands that they themselves notated for one hand. And we've seen how major pianists built on all these principles in devising redistributions to improve performance of Beethoven's piano sonatas. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to piano technique because all performers possess unique physical mechanisms and musical instincts. Pianists must decide for themselves whether and how to employ redistribution to meet their own technical needs and expressive aims in performance. They should do so secure in the knowledge that the practice has been a valuable tool used by keyboard performers for centuries. Thanks so much for tuning in today. If you're interested in digging deeper into this topic, check out these resources that are linked in the handout. And this QR code here also links you to the handout.